The sound of rain drumming against wooden walls fills the silence between two strangers who never expected to spend the night together in a cabin that isn't theirs. The diesel engine of my 18-wheeler had been my only companion for 3 years now. Mile after mile, state after state, the road was home because everywhere else had stopped feeling safe. My name's Michael Shields, and I learned the hard way that loving someone openly could cost you everything: your family, your job, your sense of belonging anywhere. I remember the exact moment my old life ended. It was a Tuesday morning in Phoenix, and I was loading up for a run to Denver when my supervisor, Bill, walked over with that look, the one that said your world's about to change and not for the better. "We got a complaint, Michael, about you and your lifestyle." He couldn't even say the words. 3 weeks later, after 18 years with Roadmaster Freight, I was cleaning out my locker and wondering how loving James had become something shameful enough to cost me my career. The CB radio crackled with other drivers' voices, but I kept mine turned low. Connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. At 42, I'd perfected the art of moving through life without leaving traces, without forming attachments that could shatter like my last relationship had. James had lasted 2 years before he decided he wanted someone who could take him home for Christmas dinner without causing a family crisis. "I can't keep living in your shadows, Marcus," he'd said, packing his things while I pretended to read the paper. "I need someone who's proud to be with me." The thing was, I was proud and terrified, which apparently looked the same from the outside. Now I drove for smaller companies, independent operators who cared more about clean driving records than personal lives. The pay was inconsistent, the routes longer, but nobody asked questions about why I never mentioned a wife or talked about going home for holidays. Home was wherever I parked for my mandatory rest periods, truck stops with harsh fluorescent lighting and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with motor oil. The Washington state forest stretched endlessly on both sides of Highway 101, pine trees standing like silent sentries in the pre-dawn mist. This was my favorite run, Seattle to Portland and back, through some of the most beautiful country in America. The trees didn't judge, the mountains didn't care who you loved, and the road just kept unfolding ahead like an endless promise of somewhere else to be. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, and the rhythmic thrum of tires on wet asphalt was hypnotic. The radio played classic country, Patsy Cline singing about walking after midnight, and for a moment I let myself remember dancing with James in our kitchen, him laughing as I tried to lead. But memories were dangerous things on long hauls. They made you careless, made you think about what you'd lost instead of where you were going. This was how I preferred it, just me, the road, and the steady hum of the engine that never asked questions about who I was or why I kept running. The truck was a 2018 Peterbilt Royal Blue with silver accents, and she ran like a dream. I bought her with the settlement money from the wrongful termination lawsuit that my lawyer said we'd never win but somehow did. Your truck, your rules, your life, I told myself the day I signed the papers. Freedom, even if it came wrapped in loneliness. Thunder rolled overhead as storm clouds gathered, turning the morning sky the color of old bruises. The weather radio had been warning about heavy rain and possible flooding, but I was still 200 miles from my delivery deadline, and freight companies didn't care about weather unless it made national news. The windshield wipers began their rhythmic dance as the first fat raindrops splattered against the glass. I thought about calling in, finding somewhere to wait out the storm, but where would I go? Back to the empty apartment I kept in Spokane but rarely saw. Back to family dinners where everyone asked about my friend and pretended not to understand why I never brought anyone around. The road was honest in its emptiness. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. The breakdown happened 20 miles past the last truck stop, in a stretch of forest so thick it swallowed sound like a hungry mouth. One moment I was cruising at 60, listening to the engine's steady purr and watching the rain turn the world soft and gray around me. The next, my dashboard was lighting up like Christmas morning, but not the good kind. The engine started coughing first, a rough, irregular sound that made my stomach drop. I'd been driving long enough to know that sound meant expensive problems. Then came the electrical issues, headlights flickering, CB radio cutting in and out, the diesel engine's computer system throwing codes faster than I could read them. By the time I managed to coast to the shoulder, she was completely dead, not even the emergency flashers working. I sat in the sudden silence for a moment, listening to the rain drum against the roof and feeling that familiar weight settle in my chest. This was what happened when you let yourself relax, when you started thinking maybe things were going okay. Life had a way of reminding you that safety was an illusion, especially for people like me who didn't fit into neat, acceptable boxes. That's when I saw him, a figure hunched over a motorcycle about 50 yards ahead, completely soaked and clearly having his own mechanical crisis. Even through the rain, I could see his frustration in the way he moved, hands gesturing at his bike like he was having an argument with it. As I climbed down from my cab, pulling my jacket hood up against the downpour, I could hear him cursing creatively in what sounded like Spanish mixed with frustrated English. "Engine trouble," I called out, already knowing the answer but needing something to break the tension of approaching a stranger. In my experience, people usually looked at a 6'2" truck driver with suspicion until proven otherwise. He looked up, pushing wet dark hair from his eyes, and I got my first real look at him. Maybe 35, with the kind of face that belonged in old photographs, strong jaw, expressive dark eyes, skin weathered by sun and wind. His hands were paint-stained and calloused, working hands that told stories of their own. He wore paint-splattered jeans and a denim jacket that was probably warm when dry, but now just looked like a soggy second skin. "Dead battery, I think," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that made the words sound like music. "Or maybe the alternator. Hell, could be anything. You." "Something with the electrical system," I replied, gesturing back at my truck. "She just died on me. We're both stuck." The rain was coming down harder now, the kind of Pacific Northwest downpour that turns the world into a watercolor painting where everything bleeds together. Through the trees, I spotted something that made my heart sink and leap simultaneously. A small cabin, dark windows staring out from between the pines like sleepy eyes, but it had a roof and walls and the promise of being dry. "There," I pointed through the rain. "Looks like some kind of hunting cabin. We could wait out the storm, maybe figure out our next move." He followed my gaze, and I watched him weigh his options. Trust a stranger or stand in the rain with a broken motorcycle. When you put it like that, the choice seemed obvious, but I'd learned that obvious choices often weren't easy ones, especially when you'd been hurt before. "I'm Diego," he said finally, extending a paint-stained hand. "Diego Morales." "Michael Shields," I replied, shaking his hand and trying not to notice how warm it was despite the rain. "Looks like we're going to be roommates for a while." His laugh was unexpected, bright and genuine despite our circumstances. My grandmother always said God has a sense of humor. Guess we're about to find out if she was right. As we gathered what we could carry, my emergency kit, his backpack, whatever food and dry clothes we could find, I tried to ignore how his presence made the space around me feel less empty for the first time in years. This was temporary, I told myself. Just two stranded travelers sharing shelter until the storm passed. Nothing more complicated than basic human decency. But as we hurried through the forest toward the cabin, dodging low branches and trying not to slip on the wet pine needles, I couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes the most important journeys begin with the most unexpected detours. The cabin was older than I'd expected, maybe from the 1970s, with that weathered wood siding that spoke of decades of Pacific Northwest weather. The door was unlocked, a hunter's shelter, by the look of the rifle rack and the faded deer hunting calendars still hanging on the walls. It was basic but clean. One room with a wood stove, two twin beds, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom that probably had indoor plumbing sometime in the last century. Diego found dry firewood stacked neatly beside the stove while I worked on getting it lit, my hands remembering the rhythm from childhood camping trips with my father before things got complicated between us. The smell of pine smoke began to fill the room, mixing with the scent of rain and something else, paint, maybe, or the particular smell of someone who spends their life outdoors. "You do this often?" Diego asked, settling across from me at the small wooden table with 2 cups of instant coffee he'd found in the cabin's provisions. Steam rose from the mugs like small prayers. "Pick up stranded travelers." "Never," I said, and realized it was true. In 3 years of driving, I'd passed hundreds of broken-down vehicles, always with someplace else to be, always with reasons not to get involved. "You accept help from truckers?" "Also never." He smiled, the first real one I'd seen, and it transformed his whole face. "Guess we're both breaking patterns." The afternoon stretched ahead of us, rain drumming steadily against the windows and the fire crackling in the stove. We were stuck, really stuck, no cell service, no way to call for help until the storm passed and we could hike back to the highway. It should have been awkward, 2 strangers trapped in a small space with nothing but time and instant coffee between them. Instead, I found myself relaxing for the first time in months. Maybe it was the warmth of the fire, or the sound of rain that made the outside world seem distant and unreal. Maybe it was the way Diego moved around the space like he belonged there, checking the stove, organizing our supplies, making the cabin feel less like shelter and more like a temporary home. "So what's your story?" he asked, pulling out a small sketchbook and a pencil from his backpack. "Besides driving truck, I mean, you seem like someone with stories." It was a dangerous question, the kind that led to territory I usually avoided. But something about the isolation, the storm, the way he asked without pushing made me want to answer honestly. "Used to work for a big freight company," I said, wrapping my hands around the coffee mug for warmth. 18 years, good benefits, steady roots, thought I had it figured out. What happened? Got fired for being gay. The words came out easier than I'd expected. Someone saw me with my boyfriend, reported it to management. Suddenly my driving record didn't matter, my years of service didn't matter. What mattered was that I made some people uncomfortable. Diego's pencil stopped moving across the page. I'm sorry, that's bullshit. It was, but fighting it just made everything worse. Family sided with the company, said maybe it was for the best, maybe I should think about changing. Boyfriend decided he didn't want to deal with the drama. I stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. Turns out love doesn't always survive reality. James, I continued, the name feeling strange in my mouth after months of avoiding it. We were together 2 years. He was a teacher, elementary school. Sweet guy, patient, the kind of person who remembered your birthday and left little notes in your lunch. I laughed, but it didn't sound happy. He wanted me to come out to my family, be open about us, said he was tired of being my dirty secret. Were you? Diego asked gently, keeping him secret. I thought I was protecting us both. My family's traditional Chinese American, very focused on appearances, on not making waves. Being gay wasn't. It wasn't part of their plan for me, and trucking's not exactly known for being progressive. I shrugged. Easier to keep things separate. Until you couldn't. Until I couldn't, I agreed, and then everything fell apart at once. Diego set down his sketchbook and moved to the kitchenette, rummaging through the cabinets. My turn, he said, pulling out a can of soup and a pot. Fair's fair. As he cooked, and he actually knew what he was doing, unlike my usual diet of truck stop sandwiches, he told me about his life. He'd grown up in San Antonio, the middle child in a big Catholic family. His mother made the world's best tamales, his father worked construction, and his 3 sisters never let him get away with anything. I was the artistic one, he said, stirring the soup with a wooden spoon that had probably been in the cabin since Carter was president. Always drawing on everything, walls, sidewalks, the margins of my homework. My mom used to joke that I came out of the womb holding a crayon. He'd studied art in college, gotten a degree in graphic design, even had a job at an advertising agency in Austin for a few years. Corporate life, he said with a grimace. Designing logos for companies that sold things people didn't need. I was good at it, made decent money, had health insurance and a 401k, and everything my parents wanted for me. But I was dying inside, slow death by conference call and stock photography. He laughed, but like mine, it held more pain than humor. And then I fell in love with my neighbor, guy named Tommy who restored vintage motorcycles in his garage. First time I'd ever felt that way about anyone. The story that followed was painfully familiar, the secret relationship, the growing need to be honest, the hope that family love would be stronger than prejudice. Diego had finally come out to his parents on Christmas Eve, thinking that the season of love and forgiveness might make them more accepting. My father didn't speak to me for 2 years, Diego said quietly, ladling soup into bowls. My mother cried like someone had died. My sisters, they tried, but it was awkward, like they didn't know how to be around me anymore. And Tommy. Tommy was great, supportive, understanding, everything you'd want in a partner. But watching me lose my family, dealing with the drama, the questions from neighbors, Diego shook his head. He started talking about moving somewhere more liberal, starting fresh. I wasn't ready. I kept thinking if I just gave my family time, they'd come around. Did they? My mom did eventually. We talk now, careful conversations where we avoid certain topics, but at least we talk. Dad's still working on it. My sisters are better. He sat down across from me with the soup, but Tommy got tired of waiting for my life to get easier. Can't say I blame him. We ate in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain and the fire and the wind moving through the trees outside. The soup was surprisingly good, tomato with herbs that Diego had found in the cabin's spice rack, and it warmed me from the inside out. So now you travel, I said, paint murals. Paint murals, sleep under stars, go where the wind takes me. He gestured toward the window where rain streaked the glass, though sometimes the wind takes you to interesting places. Is that what this is, interesting? Diego looked at me across the table and something passed between us, a recognition, maybe, or just the acknowledgement that we were both here, in this moment, because our other plans had fallen apart. Yeah, he said softly, I think it might be. As evening fell, we found ourselves on the floor in front of the fire, Diego's sketchbook open between us. He'd been drawing all afternoon, the cabin, the rain on the windows, me when he thought I wasn't looking. His style was loose and expressive, capturing not just what things looked like, but how they felt. You're good at this, I said, studying a sketch of the forest outside the cabin. He'd somehow made the rain visible, turned the gray afternoon into something beautiful and melancholy. "It's how I make sense of the world," he replied. "Everything's temporary, you know, but if you draw it, if you really look at it and put it on paper, you get to keep a piece of it forever." "Is that why you do the murals?" "Partly, but mostly I do them because they bring color to places that need it. Small towns, forgotten neighborhoods, walls that have been blank so long people stop seeing them." He flipped to a page covered in sketches of what looked like a mural in progress, children playing in a garden, bright and joyful. Art should be for everyone, not just people who can afford gallery tickets. I found myself telling him about my own forgotten dreams, how I'd wanted to study engineering before family pressure and financial reality steered me toward more practical choices. How I sometimes still drew mechanical diagrams on napkins when I was bored, designing imaginary machines that would never exist. "You could go back to school," Diego said. "It's not too late." At 42, starting over, I shook my head. "I don't even know where I'd live. The truck's my home now." "Home's not a place," Diego said, looking at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. "Home's where you feel like yourself." "Then I guess I'm homeless," I said, trying to make it sound like a joke. "Or maybe you just haven't found it yet." The storm intensified outside, but inside something was building between us, a warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove. We were two people who'd been running from different versions of the same pain, and somehow in this temporary shelter, we'd found something neither of us had been looking for. It was dangerous and foolish and probably temporary, but as I watched Diego sketch by firelight, his face serious with concentration, I thought maybe dangerous and foolish didn't have to mean wrong. Around midnight, the rain softened to a whisper against the windows, and an unexpected quiet settled over the cabin like a held breath. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting everything in warm amber light that made the small space feel intimate, sacred even. Diego was sketching again, stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking, the pencil making soft scratching sounds against paper that somehow felt loud in the silence. I'd been lying on one of the narrow beds, supposedly trying to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet. Every time I closed my eyes, I was hyper-aware of his presence across the room, the sound of his breathing, the rustle of paper, the way he occasionally hummed under his breath while he worked. It had been so long since I'd shared space with another person like this, so long since I'd felt the particular tension that comes from wanting something you're not sure you should have. "Can't sleep either," Diego asked softly, setting down his sketchbook. "Too quiet," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. After 3 years of sleeping in truck cabs with the constant hum of highway traffic and idling engines, the forest silence felt almost oppressive. But the real reason I couldn't sleep was sitting 6 feet away from me, beautiful and complicated and dangerous in ways I was trying not to think about. Diego moved to the window, looking out at the rain-washed forest. In the dim light, I could see the outline of his profile, the curve of his neck, the way his t-shirt clung to his shoulders. "It's beautiful out there," he said, "peaceful." "Lonely," I replied without thinking. He turned to look at me, and something in his expression made my chest tighten. "Is that what you think this is, loneliness?" "Isn't it?" I sat up, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. Two people running from their problems, stuck together by circumstance. "Maybe that's how it started," Diego said, moving closer. He sat on the edge of his bed, facing me, our knees almost touching in the small space, "but it doesn't feel like running anymore." The air between us felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I could smell the lingering scent of wood smoke in his hair, see the paint stain on his thumb from where he'd been sketching. He was close enough to touch, and every rational part of my brain was screaming warnings about getting involved, about complicating things, about the inevitable hurt that came from letting people matter. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was careful, gentle. "Sure. Why do you really keep moving?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. I could have given him the easy answer: work, money, freedom. I could have deflected with a joke or changed the subject. Instead, I found myself telling the truth. "Because staying still means hopping," I said, the words coming from somewhere deep and raw. "And hopping means risking everything again. It means believing that maybe this time will be different, maybe this person won't leave when things get hard, and I can't." I stopped, my voice catching on emotions I'd been avoiding for 3 years. "You can't what?" "I can't survive being wrong again," I finished quietly. "I gave James everything I had. When he left, when my family chose their reputation over their son, when I lost my job and my home and everything I thought was permanent. I barely made it through that. I can't do it again." Diego was quiet for a long moment, and I thought maybe I'd said too much, revealed too much of the broken places I usually kept hidden. But then he reached across the space between us and took my hand in his fingers warm and steady against my palm. "What if," he said quietly, "instead of running from the risk, we ran toward something worth it?" I looked down at our joined hands, his paint-stained and artistic, mine scarred from years of handling freight and machinery. Two different lives, two different kinds of damage, but somehow they fit together like pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I'd been trying to solve. "I don't know how to do that anymore," I whispered. "I don't know how to be anything other than afraid." "Neither do I," Diego admitted. "After Tommy, after my family, I told myself it was easier to keep moving, keep painting, never stay anywhere long enough to matter to anyone or have them matter to me." He shifted closer, and I could see the vulnerability in his dark eyes. "But sitting here with you talking like this, it doesn't feel easy anymore. It feels necessary." The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks. Rain tapped against the windows like gentle fingers, and for the first time in 3 years I stopped running, at least in my heart. "I'm scared," I said, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. "Me too," Diego replied, leaning forward until our foreheads almost touched. "But I'm more scared of spending another night wondering what if." When he kissed me, it was soft and tentative at first, a question more than a statement. His lips tasted like coffee and something sweet, maybe hope, and when I kissed him back, it felt like coming home to a place I'd never been but somehow recognized. We broke apart, breathing hard, and I could see my own wonder reflected in his eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to be strangers sharing shelter, nothing more. But the heart doesn't care about supposed to, and mine was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Stay with me tonight," Diego whispered, his hand still in mine. "Not forever, not with promises about tomorrow, just tonight." I thought about all the reasons to say no, all the ways this could go wrong, all the pain that came from letting people close enough to hurt you. But I also thought about the ache of sleeping alone for 3 years, the weight of carrying all my fears and hopes and dreams without anyone to share them with. "Okay," I said, and the word felt like a prayer. We moved together to the larger bed, not frantically but with the careful tenderness of people who understood that moments like this were precious and rare. Diego's skin was warm under my hands, his body solid and real in a way that made me feel more present than I had in months. When we made love, it was with the desperate gentleness of survivors finding each other in the dark. Afterward, we lay wrapped around each other, listening to the rain slow to a gentle patter. Diego's head was on my chest, his breathing deep and even, and I felt something I hadn't felt since before everything fell apart: peace. "Michael," his voice was sleepy, content. "Yeah, thank you." "For what?" "For stopping." I kissed the top of his head, tasting rain and possibility. Outside, the storm was ending, but inside, something new was just beginning. 6 months later, I'm driving the same stretch of Highway 101, but everything has changed. The rain is gentle today, more mist than downpour, and the forests are that impossible Pacific Northwest green that looks like someone turned up the saturation on the world. Diego rides alongside me on his motorcycle, the Kawasaki purring in harmony with my Peterbilt's diesel engine, and the sight of him in my mirrors still makes my heart do things I thought it had forgotten how to do. It hasn't been easy, nothing worthwhile ever is. Those first few weeks after the storm were careful, tentative, long phone calls between deliveries, texts with photos of sunsets and interesting roadside attractions, the slow dance of two people learning to trust again. Diego would send me pictures of his latest mural, bright splashes of color on previously blank walls in small towns I'd never heard of. I'd send him photos of landscapes from my roots, trying to see the beauty he'd taught me to notice. "I'm in Missoula for a week," he'd text, "painting a school, you anywhere nearby?" More often than not, I'd find a reason to be. My routes became less about efficiency and more about possibility, and my dispatcher started asking questions about why I kept volunteering for runs to places I'd never shown interest in before. The first time we met up intentionally, a truck stop outside Billings where I was taking my mandatory rest period and he happened to be passing through. We were both nervous as teenagers on a first date. But when he climbed up into my cab and saw how I'd reorganized things to make space for his art supplies, when I showed him the small sketches I'd started making in my logbook margins, something settled between us. "This could work," he said, studying the narrow bunk where I'd made room for two. "It won't be comfortable," I warned. "Truck living isn't glamorous." "Neither is motorcycle camping," Diego replied, kissing me hello like it was the most natural thing in the world. "But comfortable's overrated." Learning to live and travel together required compromise and creativity. We invested in a small cargo trailer that could be towed behind either vehicle, big enough for Diego's art supplies and the camping gear we'd need for the nights when truck stops weren't an option. He got a CB radio and learned the trucker's vocabulary of road conditions and weather warnings. I started paying attention to mural festivals and art shows, planning routes that would take us through cities where Diego could find work. The challenges were real and sometimes harsh. Not every truck stop was welcoming to a mixed-race couple, and some of the smaller towns where Diego painted murals looked at us with suspicion that could turn ugly without warning. We learned to read situations quickly, to have backup plans and safe words, and the kind of situational awareness that comes from knowing not everyone wishes you well. Maybe we should paint over it, I suggested one evening in Montana, looking at the fresh graffiti someone had spray-painted over Diego's mural overnight, ugly words I won't repeat, meant to wound and diminish. No, Diego said firmly, mixing new paint colors by the light of my truck's headlights. That's what they want, for us to disappear, to give up, to decide it's not worth the fight. He looked at me, and I could see the determination in his eyes that had probably gotten him through coming out to his family, through losing his first love, through all the hard moments that had led him to that broken-down motorcycle on a rainy highway. But the kids who walk past this wall every day to school deserve to see something beautiful. They deserve to know that love comes in all colors, all shapes, all kinds of people. He repainted the damaged sections and added something new, two birds flying together, different species but sharing the same sky. It was beautiful and defiant and absolutely him. Some nights we sleep in the truck, curled together in the narrow bunk while the engine idles and the CB radio whispers with late-night chatter from other drivers crossing the country in the darkness. Diego has learned to sleep through the highway sounds, and I've learned to appreciate the way he unconsciously reaches for me in his sleep, even in the cramped space. Other nights we find small motels where we can spread out his sketches and plan his next project, where we can shower together and make love without worrying about thin walls and close neighbors. Diego is teaching me to see the country differently, not as a series of destinations connected by miles to be covered, but as a living canvas full of stories and possibilities. He's also teaching me that vulnerability isn't the same as weakness. When we video call with his family, and we do, now, regular Sunday conversations where his mother asks about my driving and his sisters want to know if I'm taking care of him, I'm learning that love isn't always perfect, but it can grow and change and make room for new realities. My own family is harder. My parents still don't know about Diego, about any of it really. But my sister called last week, first time in 2 years, and when she asked if I was happy, I found myself saying yes without hesitation. "You sound different," she said, lighter. "I am," I told her. "I met someone." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her processing, remembering old conversations and carefully avoided topics. "Tell me about them," she said finally, and the pronoun choice felt like a gift. The cabin where we met has become a regular stop. We've left supplies there for other stranded travelers, better coffee, some canned goods, a first aid kit, and a note. Sometimes being lost is how we find exactly where we belong. Last month, we found a response written in pencil on the back of our note. "Thank you. This place saved my life too. A grateful stranger." Diego has started a new project, a series of murals in truck stops and travel centers, places where people like us might need to see a reminder that they're not alone. The first one went up in a family-owned truck stop in Wyoming, a landscape that manages to be both epic and intimate, with a quote painted along the bottom in Diego's careful lettering: "The road goes on forever, but you don't have to travel it alone." This morning, driving through the same Washington forests where everything changed, I hear our engines humming in harmony, his motorcycle beside my truck, both of us heading toward whatever comes next. The CB radio crackles with morning chatter from other drivers, the usual mix of weather reports, traffic conditions, and the kind of dark humor that gets you through long nights and longer miles. "Got a good one for you," comes a familiar voice through the radio static. It's Big Jim, a driver I've known for years, someone who was never particularly friendly before but who's warmed up since Diego started riding with me. "What do you call a trucker with a motorcycle escort?" "Don't know, Jim, what?" I respond, glancing in my mirror to see Diego grinning behind his helmet visor. "Lucky," comes the reply, followed by laughter from half a dozen other drivers on the channel. Diego pulls up beside my cab and gives me a thumbs up, and I realize that this moment, this morning, this life we've built out of broken-down vehicles and unexpected shelter, is everything I thought I'd lost when my old world fell apart. The road that once meant running away now means running together, and that makes all the difference. Not because it's always easy, not because we don't still carry our scars and fears, but because we've learned that home isn't a place you arrive at. Home is what you build with someone who sees your damage and chooses to stay anyway, who helps you carry the weight and reminds you that love, real love, isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to keep trying, to keep growing, to keep choosing each other even when the road gets rough. Especially when the road gets rough. My phone buzzes with a text from Diego. Coffee stop in 20 miles. I want to sketch that barn we passed. Copy that, I text back. I want to sketch you sketching that barn. His laughter carries over the radio static in the wind, and ahead of us, the road unfolds like a promise of everywhere we haven't been yet but will discover together. The GPS says we're still 400 miles from our destination, but for the first time in my life, the journey matters more than where it ends. Behind us, storm clouds gather on the horizon, but we're driving towards sunlight, and that seems like the most important direction of all.